We also saw William Ralph Emerson, a well-known architect who, with Carl Femer, had actually built the receiving tomb here at the cemetery. And whereas he himself designed numerous, not only country estates around the Boston area, of which there were 11 in Milton, but even in Maine, he's called the father of shingle-style architecture. And his co-partner was John Fox, an architect from Dorchester who was called the father of stick-style architecture. Both of these men, Emerson and Fox, were important features of what we saw of the development of Boston in this 19th century. After the Civil War, so much building took place in and around the Boston area that these two architects, who did design extremely important buildings, also had a practice that actually showed shingle and stick-style architecture being built in Jamaica Plain, Dorchester, Roxbury, and even the suburbs, such as Milton, Dedham, and Brookline. Architects, as well as even writers, such as Eugene O'Neill. And when he died in the 1940s, it was brought here to Forsyth Chapel for a memorial service. The then president of the cemetery tried to stop two women who had arrived in men's suits and top hats, one of which was Katharine Hepburn. The idea was that not only did we have a series of writers that went the gamut from E.E. Cummings and Eugene O'Neill, but we'd even have Edward Everett Hale. And though Edward Everett Hale was probably best known for the fact that he was a Unitarian minister in Boston, and it was actually said that 1 + 1 = 10, his idea of a benevolent aspect for Unitarians, it was best known that he was the author of A Man Without a Country. And we saw that Edward Everett Hale, a nephew of Edward Everett, the governor of Massachusetts, president of Harvard, and minister to the court of St. James, was an important feature. He lived in Roxbury and would actually be, for 55 years, minister of the 12th Congregational Society in Boston's South End. Each of these writers were important features, but one man took it to new heights, and General Charles Taylor would later found what became known as the Boston Globe. And today the Globe is probably one of the premier newspapers in around New England. But Taylor had been born and raised in Charlestown, later lived in Somerville, and he later parlayed his intelligence in such a way that the family would run the paper until very recent memory. The whole concept here was that each of these people made a contribution to this rich overlay. But one person, who is someone that actually has a monument almost directly opposite where we are this afternoon, was Martin Milmore. And seen here in a photograph that was actually found in the depths of a drawer at the Boston Athenaeum, was a photograph of a man who was thought to be not only one of the most debonair men in Boston, but he was also one of the most skilled as a sculptor. And he and his brother had come from Ireland, and eventually, in the period of the mid-19th century, would not only sculpt the wonderful Sphinx at what is today Mount Auburn Cemetery, but they would later be memorialized here at the cemetery with this wonderful sculpture, Death Staying the Hand of the Sculptor. And this postcard actually shows it in the original location of the Milmore grave, which is on the far end of the cemetery by the Walk-Hill Street gates. But the building itself of this monument was just too important not to see it near the gates. And in 1945, at the instigation of the Milmore family, it was moved here, as we see, just to the right of the entrance gates themselves. These sculptors were important, but we would also see that many other people would actually have sculptors actually create very impressive monuments for their graves. Here, we began to realize that this man, with a wonderful portrait by, as we see, John Singer Sargent, would be George Robert White. His great claim to fame was that he actually made and sold Cure soap. And Cure soap didn't just cleanse the body, but it was thought to have special medicinal purposes. He had started his life with Potter and Weeks, a well-known druggist company in Boston, but by the period of the late 19th century, he was a multimillionaire. He served on many boards, including the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. But when he died, he created what was called the George Robert White Fund. And in the 1920s, these funds would actually create health centers throughout the city of Boston. And these health centers would actually provide medical attention for many of the immigrants and their children, some of which did not speak English. And the idea was that when he was interred here at Forest Hills, he had this wonderful angel. And we see in some ways that it actually has an endowment, which is always very nice to know. But it's also the fact that this itself was probably one of the greatest angels done by Daniel Chester French. In some ways, each of these people's monuments themselves are things that we admire and are walking towards. But we also have to realize in some ways that some of these very simple exedra-type tombs are things that actually don't always get mentioned. This is a man by the name of George Barron. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of him. George Walker Barron lived on Beacon Street in Back Bay. He was actually the man who actually owned the Dow Jones Company and the Wall Street Journal. And in the period of the early 20th century, he parlayed his intelligence with only a high school education through the Boston English High School into what became one of the best purveyors of financial information to investors. And Barron's magazine still is published on a weekly basis and still bears his name. We realize that each of these people, and even here, William Alfred Payne, one of the co-founders of Payne Weber, would be immortalized. In this instance, his grave would actually have a monument designed by Tiffany Studios. The portrait, which was also done by Tiffany, showed a man who had started life in Roxbury. His father was a minister, and he too is buried here. But he himself would go on to actually found one of the premier investment houses in late 19th century America. It parlayed itself in the 20th century of creating many fortunes for not only Boston families, but families throughout the United States. Philanthropists would go the gamut, and we realize that in some ways a few would include Pauline Agassiz Shaw. She herself was the wife of Quincy Adams Shaw, who lived here in Jamaica Plain. They refused to move into town in the winter. Her father was Louis Agassiz, who had come from Switzerland to teach at Harvard College. And later, she and her husband would actually live in Jamaica Plain, but actually undertake the support of close to 31 individual charities. Her great claim to fame was that she had to establish the North Bennett Street School, that not only provided education and tutoring for people in tailoring, watchmaking, bookbinding, basket weaving, shoemaking, and cobblering, but it was an important feature that survives to this day. When her husband died in 1916 and was buried here at Forest Hills, he was said in his obituary to be the richest man in New England. Not a bad claim to fame. But we also saw people such as Susan Dimmock, for whom the Dimmock Street Health Center in Roxbury is named. She was one of the earliest medical physicians that was a female in 19th century America. Later, in the period of the 1870s, at the age of 27, she took a trip to Europe, and she died actually drowning on a ship. And the idea was that she was brought back to Forest Hills, and her claim to fame was that she was associated with the New England Hospital for Women and Children. Each of these people were important, but even Lucy Stone that I had mentioned earlier. And Lucy Stone herself would not only be the first woman to be cremated at Forest Hill Cemetery, but having actually been the first female to be graduated from college in 1838, her great claim to fame was that not only was she an abolitionist, but she was a women's rights movement person. Her daughter Alice Stone Blackwell is also buried here. And Amelia Peabody. Many of you might have known her. This woman had been born to great wealth. Her father was one of the partners of Kidder Peabody and Company. In many ways, Amelia Peabody herself would move from Commonwealth Avenue in Boston to her farm in Dover. And she herself was a trained sculptress in her own right, and a very good one. When she died, she left over $800 million to two distinct foundations, some of which have assisted Forest Hills in the restoration of the Gateway just a few years ago. And we realize that each of these people, in some ways, chose Forest Hills as their place of internment, but they again, in some ways, made a far-reaching consequence and contribution. Some people, such as Albert Pope, were called the father of good roads. He himself was the man who actually invented the Columbia bicycle, and throughout the latter part of the 19th century had a wonderful factory that was in the South End, just adjacent to what is the former Youth Companion building at the corner of Berkeley Street and Tremont Street. In that aspect, Pope himself was someone who actually had bicycle exhibitions that actually made the sale of bicycles possible throughout the Boston area. And later, in the period of the early 20th century, producing automobiles in Hartford, Connecticut, he actually advocated for better roads for these automobiles to actually be driven on. And we'd also even see the Forsyth family lot. And the Forsyths themselves actually had made their money, as I mentioned earlier, in a belting and rubber company in Roxbury. It was a very marketable concern. The vulcanization of rubber in that period was very important, but creating belts that ran the machinery and actually spurred on the economy of late 19th century Boston made the Forsyth brothers very wealthy. Eventually, they would place this monument in the very center of the lot. It was designed by Lee Lowry, a fairly well-known architect at the time when he was doing this. But you have to realize that this is something that actually became more important after Lee Lowry matured in his sculpting technique. If you've ever seen Atlas at the Rockefeller Center in New York City, that too was designed by Lee Lowry. So you begin to realize that some of these families' lots are actually memorialized with very important sculpture, public sculpture. But we also had people such as even Eben Jordan. And maybe, like me, you can't call Macy's anything other than Jordan Marsh. If you do, you actually date yourself. But Jordan Marsh was a major mainstay in Boston. And seen here in a portrait that was done in the latter part of the 19th century, Ebediah Jordan himself was someone who didn't just have a department store in Boston, but his family would go on to actually found Jordan Hall, of major importance in Boston, and they were also instrumental in the Boston Opera House, something that unfortunately was demolished after World War II. We see in some ways that these people themselves create not only an important feature, but even this man, somebody you may not know, but John Reese. I think everyone here has some sort of a little sleeve where a button had to actually be affixed on your shirt or blouse this afternoon. John Reese's claim to fame was he invented the Reese buttonhole machine, and it actually standardized buttonholes in late 19th century Boston. In some ways, this very handsome man in a photograph that was found at the Boston Public Library shows the importance of something that we take for granted. When he was buried here at Forest Hills, the family commissioned a man by the name of William Ordway Partridge, a very well-known sculptor who lived in Milton but later in New York City, to actually place a seated memorial to Reese in a form of an exedra with a seat. An important feature, but we also realize that even Jenny Oil and Gasoline was immortalized here at Forest Hills. And if you remember Jenny Gasoline, you're again dating yourself. We realize in some ways that Forest Hills, by the period of the early 20th century, had fulfilled the wishes of Henry Dearborn. Forest Hills was a rural cemetery created by the city of Roxbury as a municipal place of burial. It later became a private foundation in such a way that itself was actually administered by a board of trustees. This beautiful aspect of Lake Hibiscus, magnificent panoramic views, hills, dells, and valleys continued. But we realized in some ways that today, thanks not only to the trustees of Forest Hill Cemetery, but the trustees of the Forest Hills Educational Trust, many different Bostonians begin to see this cemetery, which is not only an active place of internment, but a place that many people come on weekends to actually see public sculpture, public monuments, and the wonderful aspects of horticulture. And here, a man by the name of Al Mays, who is called the veteran walking tour guide, has done it for many, many years, shows a group of people Lucy Bixby's monument, a wonderful thing that shows the stern visions enveloped in a small group of roses. Hundreds of people come on a monthly basis. But we also begin to realize that it's not just adults, but even children. And seen here that the citizen soldier, done by Martin Milmore, is actually explained to a group of inner city children with these summer camps where they come on the weekly basis to actually begin to experience not just a cemetery as a place of internment, but as a place that can be appreciated by people of all ages and all walks of life. In some ways, the Trust has continued in some ways to not only continue the arts, but in this way, a grouping of mesh nightshirts would actually be placed on trees to somewhat replicate the shroud of the 19th century. And this very inquisitive child actually touches this because it's actually made of screen, much like one might have on windows at home. But the idea here was it was also dwelling. A program a few years ago where an artist would actually create out of cement little houses that would actually replicate the once temporal homes of the permanent residents of Forest Hills. In the foreground it says grocer. This was the home of S.S. Pierce that was on Marsh Street, or present Gallivan Boulevard in Dorchester. Mary Hunt, who was a temperance member. And also we began to realize that even Anne Sexton, the well-known poet. In some ways, each of these were an important feature, even creating new statues such as Fern Cunningham's wonderful African woman. Seen here, a man actually continues to not only maintain it, the patina needs to be continually worked on if they're to actually be in the outdoors, but we realize that public art, continued statuary, and even the Lantern Festival were things that brought people of all walks of life. A few years back, the Lantern Festival itself started and today brings thousands of people in an evening where a Korean-inspired afternoon and early evening actually continues, not only with music and dance, but as we see here, the Korean musicians standing opposite the Andrew Carney Monument creates in some ways a wonderful aspect to bring people to Forest Hills, and at dusk to actually place these lanterns that float on Lake Hibiscus, and in some ways remember family and friends, some of whom are buried here, many of whom are not. Looking at this, we realize, what is the cemetery? It is truly a place that even some of us bring our beloved pets. Dog walks are an important feature, and seen here in front of Henry Dexter's wonderful St. Bernard dog, this dog takes a small rest. Each of these aspects of Forest Hills are things that not only make us think that it continues to be an overlay, but it's a way in some ways to ask, who is in the book? Well, who isn't in the book? Each of us, whether we have family or friends here or not, realize in some ways the Forest Hill Cemetery is this wonderful overlay. It's a thriving nexus of cultures, people of all walks of life. Whether one was a member of the aristocracy or an industrialist that actually made his name as a buttonhole maker, or just someone like us who was loved and eventually died and was interred here, we've become this overlay. And we see in some ways that Forest Hills, as an active place of burial, is a place that I encourage you to not only support, but to continue in some ways to come, explore, and to see in some ways the richness of our culture. Thank you very much.